Okay, just starting the recording. Okay. So welcome everyone to our keynote talk this afternoon. And we're very happy to have Amit Sahai as our keynote speaker this year. So Amit is a professor of computer science at UCLA. He's a science investigator and a fellow of the ACM and a fellow of the IACR, as well as a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and advisor to the Prison Mathematics Project. He was an invited speaker at ICM 2022, and he's also an editor of the Journal of Cryptology. And he's a co-inventor of attribute-based encryption, functional encryption, and indistinguishability obfuscation, which is what he will tell us about today. So Amit, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Great to see you more. And it's great to see everyone here. Excuse me. A little bit of a warning. I recently recovered from COVID. I'm completely negative. I've been negative for many, many days, but I have this very annoying cough that is not going away. So my apologies for the occasional explosions of coughing. So of course I was asked to create a talk for CFAIL, and I failed to create the talk, which I thought was very much in the spirit of the conference. Okay, I'm joking, but only slightly. So I do have a few slides, but really I want this to be a very interactive experience, and I would really love to hear from all of you and the organizers and other people about their experiences, because I will be talking about indistinguishability obfuscation, but really this is mainly just to talk about failure and research, and I think there's just so much to discuss and to think about in that context. Okay, so just as an outline, this is, as I mentioned, it's a very interactive talk. I only have 4 slides, so I did really pretty much fail to create a talk, just terminated after 4 slides. And I want to talk very broadly about failure, including what I think is sort of the elephant in the room that rarely gets discussed, which is the impact of failure on our psyche, right? The fact that this is a very psychological experience for all of us. And it's really, I think, impossible to talk about failure without also talking about that aspect of it for all of us. But I'll start with the story of I/O, a very personal viewpoint, just sort of my view of how it was for me. A few of my students maybe love to hear about other people, for example, who were involved in I/O research and what their experience was like. But mostly, again, I really want the talk to really be focused around failure and really how to harness, encourage, and deal with it, right? Okay, so let me first talk to you a little bit about the supposed title of this talk, about indistinguishability obfuscation. So, I've lived with I/O for so long that I can't even really imagine that maybe someone is not familiar with it, but of course I shouldn't just assume that. But this is not a technical talk, so I will not be talking about the definition of I/O and various mathematical things that led up to it. But I do want to talk about the fact that I/O is this beautiful primitive that has really captured our imagination, the imagination of our community. And there are lots of awards and stuff like that I could talk to you about, and papers and paper accounts and stuff like this. But I like this is the best illustration. Back in 2015 at the Crypto Rump session, there was a song that was developed around obfuscation called "Dream of I/O Obfuscation" by all these people mentioned here. And it was really fun, and just sort of, to me, that sort of captures the essence of how exciting this journey has been for the community. But it's a very complicated story. So I/O refers to the question of program obfuscation, right? So this is the idea of taking some computer program and somehow transforming it into an equivalent form, but that hides some essence about what implementation choices were made in the creation of that program. Okay, it's a very, very powerful, very powerful tool, and it's again it's this wonderful, wonderful thing. But it's actually very important, I think, for us to realize that it was really born of failure. So how did we get I/O? What happened was, back in 1998 or so, a bunch of us started thinking about program obfuscation. And there was a very natural sort of goal that you might want to achieve with program obfuscation, which is to sort of create a black box, right? To sort of take a program, somehow mungle it up so that it acts just like a black box that implements whatever the program implements, right? This is called the virtual black box notion. And we formalized this. And then unfortunately, we proved that it was impossible to achieve. So in this work, which is very well received, we showed a pretty powerful general impossibility result for virtual black box obfuscation. And I'll get back to this a little bit later, but that was really how that paper was received. It was just, too bad, obfuscation is impossible, right? That's what's happening here, right? But in that paper, inspired by the well-trod landscape that we all are familiar with in cryptography, we all know about simulation from zero knowledge, right, and other beautiful parts of cryptographic theory. And the original definition that we proposed, the virtual black box definition, was a simulation type of definition, and it was impossible, right? But then we know, just like we know zero knowledge has a little brother, which is witness indistinguishability, right? And we know that zero knowledge either requires interaction or trusted setup if you want a non-interactive zero knowledge proof, right? It's not possible to do non-interactive zero knowledge without a trusted setup. However, it is possible to do non-interactive witness indistinguishability, right? So there are already these things that we knew about in the context of zero knowledge that just suggested to us, honestly, like a consolation prize, right? Like it was really a consolation prize. It was tucked away on page 34 of our paper, of the full version of our paper only, not even, didn't even show up in the conference version. But we thought of this idea of I/O, that like, hey, maybe we can be inspired by witness indistinguishability and give sort of this weaker, younger brother sort of definition of obfuscation. And of course, the reason we did it was because it evaded our impossibility result, right? And we thought, this is cool. It was cool. But that's it. It was just an afterthought. It was just this consolation prize, tucked away in the corner of this paper. And, honestly, we had no idea what it would be useful for, really. We had like some tiny toy application of removing watermarks, but really we didn't know what to do with it. And we had even less of an idea of how to construct it. Like we had no clue whatsoever how to do this thing, right? So really, it began life in a very humble way, just this little thing. And then from 2001 to 2012, more than a decade, there's really this graveyard of failed attempts, and of course, I know the most about my own because I thought about them and failed, and I know how I failed and why I failed, but nothing was ever published because there was no CFAIL back then. It's really unfortunate. So no one bothered to publish anything. I do know that there were at least a couple of other people who were working on it. Probably there were many more, but we didn't know anything about what was going on. And I also know for sure that at least some of those ideas were actually really nice ideas. It would have helped the community if they had actually been made available to everyone, but it wasn't encouraged, and so that was kind of sad. But again, there was a long period of just nothing but failure. No idea how to attack this problem. And I'll get back to this also in a moment. But as someone who, of course, knew about the impossibility result, I think a lot of people just saw that big failure, like the failure of VBB obfuscation, as this no-go, like don't bother, don't waste your time on this, right? But I knew, I knew where the skeletons were. I knew like where the issues were, and so I never thought that. I always thought that there was something to be done here. And again, please, if anyone has any questions, I thought I saw someone's hand up, but anyway, please do interrupt. I would love to talk to you about that. But yeah, I thought for sure there was lots of stuff to be done here. And so I really tried to work on it, but again, just experienced nothing but failure. Generally speaking, what would happen was that every time some new trick would come up anywhere in cryptography, and I would hear about it, and I think, oh, maybe I can use this for obfuscation. And then I would go and try, and it didn't work. And I would go, oh well, that doesn't work. And then, you know, the time would move on. Of course, I was doing other things also during that time. So, you know, I want to say that, you know, there are some really amazing people, maybe like Andrew Wild or something, who can just sit in their attic and like work on one thing and not talk to anyone for years. I am not like that. You know, I love to have many ideas that I'm thinking about, so I can maybe use ideas from one area in some other domain, and like have that cross-pollination of ideas. And I'm definitely very much in favor of working on a bunch of different things, just to be clear, because I'm going to go in a certain direction in this talk. But anyway, lots and lots of failures. And then I realized that there are probably a lot of students here who don't remember this. But, you know, in 2013, late 2012, there was this amazing moment, you know, where an incredibly powerful new tool seemed to emerge, you know, in cryptography, which was this tool of approximate multilinear maps, right? Which was this amazing candidate approximate multilinear maps. Really powerful looking object. You know, I remember as soon as I saw it, I was super excited about what this could possibly be useful for. Worked on trying to use it to build actually functional encryption first. Very, very hard. Lots of failures, lots of things that didn't work along the way there too. But eventually, in that time of great excitement, we were able to show how to build I/O from multilinear maps, and also show why I/O is useful. So we built a sort of technology of using I/O to build lots of things, and it was just a wonderful time, you know, time of incredible excitement, just incredible optimism. And, you know, a lot of us had spent a lot of time thinking about these multilinear maps. You know, we had like really good intuition as to like why they should be secure. You know, really nice, intuitive understanding of like what this object is, what it can do, what it can't do. We felt that way, at least, right? And this is, you know, months and months of time that we had invested in trying to understand this mathematical object and building all this like hard-fought intuition, you know, as to like why it's good, right? And worked with many, many wonderful people, including Allison here and many others, and you know, built up a lot of beautiful theory, and you know, lots of cool results there. Lots of other also I also want to talk about sort of the psychology of research a little bit in this talk. And you know, this excitement that came out of multilinear maps didn't just affect multilinear map research, right? It actually affected everything, you know, within a certain distance of, you know, multilinear maps. And so there are also a bunch of really cool results that came out that could have come out much earlier, you know, that really didn't need any of this stuff happening, but it just came from the excitement, from this like, you know, mass hysteria that was going on in our community, which is awesome. Really wonderful time, you know, wonderful time to be alive, wonderful time to be working on this problem. And then, of course, it didn't last. And in 2015, we entered this like really dark period where attack after attack started appearing about these multilinear map candidates. All this like beautiful intuition that, you know, I thought I had developed, that other people probably thought that they had developed, turned out to be pretty much worthless. You know, at least it didn't correspond to the reality of what these objects were. And there were really some very devastating attacks, including some work that we did where we actually attacked the obfuscation scheme that we constructed back in 2013 using multilinear maps, right? So, you know, really, it was quite devastating from that point of view. You know, I was talking about this Rum Session talk, this song, and it was a great song, actually. I really like it. And I'm a little oblivious to things sometimes, so, you know, I'm not sure exactly how much of this was intended to be insulting and how much it wasn't intended to be insulting, but I think at least a part of this song, you know, the fact that it was called Dream of I/O Obfuscation, was actually meant to make fun of the people who, you know, I/O obfuscation definitely exists and, you know, and does all these wonderful things. So, you know, there was definitely this psychological phenomenon that was happening, which was this backlash, this sort of like major backlash against this research, and a lot of just reasonable doubt about things, especially for people who are a little bit further away. For people like me and people who were really in the thick of the research, I don't think any of us really ever lost faith is not the right word, but we really believe that there was a lot more to understand here. There's a lot more to really to figure out and figure out what's going on. But still, just to give a sense of what was going on in those years, it was like, here's a conjecture. Oh no, the conjecture is false. Here's another conjecture. Oh no, that conjecture is false too. Wait, here's another conjecture. Oh, that conjecture is also false. It was just, this really blistering wave of failures, of very public failures, things, many of these are my papers, I was like, hey, here's a conjecture. And then sometimes my own papers saying, oh, this conjecture is false. So, it was definitely a very public thing that was going on. And it was quite difficult. Probably more so for my students than for me, but also for me, to be honest. It was not a very pleasant experience. And that was going on for about, a lot of work was also happening. But then I also want to talk to you about this dark but also wonderful period, for me personally, from 2018 to 2021, in a really intense, wonderful collaboration with my former student Ayush Jain and longtime collaborator Rachel Lynn and some others as well in different times, but especially these two people, and it was so much fun. It was really an incredible, intense, sustained period of work. It was driven in some ways by some anxiety about, all these attacks and all these kind of things. And there was definitely this sort of dark cloud that was around. We got lots of very, very annoying reviews and, lots of patronizing comments and all those sort of things that all of us are familiar with. It's just part of our life in academia. That was all going on. And there were these dark clouds, but still what I remember the most, even during that time, was just how much fun we were having. Like, it was just incredibly fun, like incredibly fun to be working on this amazing primitive that was also the source of so much frustration and failure over decades, decades, at least for me. But it was incredibly fun. And, last year, as some of you may have heard of, we actually did figure out finally a way to achieve I/O from well-studied assumptions, and so far everything has gone well. So hopefully, return to glory from 2021 to forever. We'll see if that works out. But I do want to make one point here also that I think is very important for us to keep in mind as a community. We will get back to, and I definitely want us to really talk about the darker sides of failure and sort of experiences like this. Is that a question? In the back? No, not a question. All right. Okay. There were very difficult times here. I had many long, very personal conversations with especially my students. Some of them told me straightforwardly, I can't take this anymore. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. And that was the end of it. Yeah. Please. Yes.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, so people on Zoom can hear you.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, is it better? No difference, no?
We need the hand.
Let's see, more, can you hear?
1 second, hold on. Technical.
On Zoom, we hear. Once you use the mic, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Ah, nice. So I just wondered, do you have an idea why the failure was in the first, like from 2001 to 2012, private failure, whereas in the second phase, it was like publicly failing? Do you have an idea why this changed?
Yes, yes, yeah, this is a great question. Thank you for asking it. Like, I think really the reason for this was, I would say twofold. One is that at that earlier time of failure, the failure was less subtle in some sense. Like, things were just not working at all, you know, like it just wasn't working at all. And I really want to also mention in response to your question and in general that this 2013 publication, or 2012, sorry, publication of these multilinear map candidates, right? That was a bold move. It was a bold move by Garg, Gentry, and Halevi. It was a completely new, unstudied, you know, thing that turned out to have lots of serious flaws. We still don't understand, by the way, the exact security and complexity of multilinear maps, of these multilinear map candidates, and also in general of multilinear maps. But they were willing to go public, right? To go out there and just and put it out there. It was actually well received by the community. People thought, yeah, that sounds like a really nice thing to study, and people were able to study it. And that moved it from private to public, right? And then once someone made that first move, then, you know, we made additional conjectures, other people made additional things, and then it became all very public, right? And, you know, for a while it was just public, you know, love fest, right? It was just everyone was very happy publicly, and then it became a public failure, like a sequence of very, very public failures, which is mainly the reason I think I'm here. Like, if it would have just been that first part, I think I wouldn't have thought to talk about it, but I really want to talk about the public failure aspect of it, because yeah, it was a very public failure. Does that answer your question? Okay. Please, you can ask follow-up questions. Okay. But right, I do want to say this before moving on from sort of IO, that it's easy for us as human beings to get kind of bogged down with negative feelings and the sort of psychological aspect of these things. But I will say this, you know, when we had the result last year where we showed how to build IO from some well-studied assumptions, we weren't totally sure how the reaction would be. We were worried because, you know, history had taught us, you know, recent history had taught us that, like, you know, these papers aren't necessarily very well received, right? Like, we were worried about what the reviews would be like. And in fact, the reception was absolutely wonderful, you know, and I think one reason is because we are after all mathematicians, right? We are a mathematical community, and when a proof is correct, then it's correct, and people can verify it and they can figure it out. And maybe, of course, it takes some time for people to get confident and understand exactly what a statement is saying. But we are a community of mathematicians, and I think it's also good to see that like once the failures stop and, you know, some success, you know, comes, and the community, without any real need for intervention on our part, can already react well, and things do sort of work out. So that's another maybe reason why I'm here. So that's actually all I wanted to say about obfuscation and failure. So, you know, I really didn't want to talk a whole lot more about this. This is just sort of background, and just to give sort of a little personal story, personal taste of really my most certainly my most, you know, intimate and enduring, you know, tussle with public failure in the context of research. Again, if other people who are here who worked on IO, if they want to share their, you know, feelings and experiences along these lines, and, you know, that would also be great. Perfect spot to do that right now. Is there anyone?
So maybe I can ask a question here about the specific subject of your graveyard of failures, right? So one thing that CFAIL is trying to explain to people who are submitting is that it's not failure to get your paper published. It's showing that there was still some insightful results in there. So I'm wondering is perhaps this graveyard of failure maybe mostly failure to get a result published rather than failure to develop new insights? Or how do you see this?
Excellent. So of course, yes, there were many insights that were developed in those years, right? Especially with regard to bilinear maps, like that was something I was really thinking a lot about. And I guess what I want to say, to be honest, right, is that it wasn't just a failure for it to get accepted. It was also an internal failure on my part, for example, to even think that it was worth writing up, right? And not just because it wouldn't get published, but just even my own internal evaluation circuit, was like, not interesting, right? And I think that's a mistake. That's a mistake, that we, or at least I made, and maybe many of us make.
Is it maybe not a bit of a failing on a higher level that the education system has, where we expect people to immediately find the right solution? When people don't immediately find the right solution, it's like there's no explanation of how to even try and learn from what doesn't work. Right,
certainly, and excellent. And it's one of those bizarre things that when you have a and actually, let me just move on, because this is exactly gets to what I'm going to talk about next, which is that, imagine you have a toddler, right, little tiny toddler, and the toddler is trying to learn how to walk. I mean, the toddler, of course, will keep falling down over and over and over again, and no one thinks, oh my God, it's embarrassing, my toddler keeps falling down. That was insane. That's a completely insane way to think, right? And of course, the same thing applies to us. You're getting into a couple of my points. Actually, let me get back to the slides, but I'd like to re-engage with you in just like two points. First, I just want to say that we have to, of course, just acknowledge our incredible, privilege here, right? Thank goodness none of us are surgeons, right? Like, I would hit a surgeon who would say, oh, I learned so much from failures. Oh God, please, try on the cadaver, and like get the failures on the cadaver and then come to me, right? But thank goodness we're not surgeons, right? We're not those of us who do theory, we don't even deploy these things. We don't build them or anything of these, any of that sort of thing, right? We are here to just explore the research, the science, just understand what is the mathematics, what is true, what is not true, what's the structure of our understanding, right? And that is the place where you can fail, right? Just like we don't let our toddlers immediately go on to, higher wires or whatever, right? Like, toddlers play around in a nice, safe place. And theoreticians, we're the toddlers, we are the toddlers of this world, we get to play around in our little safe playpens with nice, soft, sand, and we get to fall down all the time. That's how we should think of ourselves, in my opinion, right? And really, I want to also take a step back away from I/O and think about cryptography. In cryptography, we are surrounded by failure. Like, it's completely ridiculous, right? Like, we don't know how to prove the most basic things in cryptography. We don't know that any one-way functions exist. Like, we don't know the most basic things. We don't know how to do hardly anything. And especially in light of that, if we think about that we are tiny little toddlers, and surrounded by failure, surrounded by almost complete lack of understanding of almost everything, then it makes even more sense that of course we're going to fail. Of course the process of research will involve failure, right? So I very much agree with what you're saying, that there's this honestly just absurd. It's not that it's wrong. Wrong suggests that someone thought it through and then said, oh yeah, well, okay, no, I disagree. It's just absurd. It's absolutely absurd to think that we theoreticians, the toddlers of our field, that we would not fail. It's completely ridiculous to think that way, in my opinion. If you disagree, please. If you disagree,
you're probably in the wrong room. So just to point out that GCCH is across the hall.
But yeah, I mean, in cryptography, I think of our successes as these tiny little pinpricks of light, right? Like surrounded by a giant sea of dark failure, right? Like everywhere there's failure, and then there's this few beautiful points of light. And I certainly appreciate our successes. I certainly appreciate the fact that we somehow manage to prove something, right? But still our understanding is extraordinarily limited. Like we hardly understand everything, and so then it makes even more sense. And really, what is happening and what you're talking about, and what I want to talk about, is that this attitude towards failure has led to a ridiculous timidity in our field. You know, we are surrounded by questions that we don't know how to answer, and in many ways, I would say we are often too timid to attack these basic questions that are just staring us right in the face, that we should at least start to try to attack. But where we're probably going to get it wrong. You know, we're probably going to make conjectures that are totally, totally wrong, but they'll help us to understand what's going on. So that's certainly one reason why I'm here right now. Any other, or did you want to follow up any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, sure. I think you're completely right in saying this, and I think it's in discussing what CFAIL is actually about, people seem to be seeing failure more as failure to get a paper published. So like, oh, I got rejected from crypto, I'll submit to CFAIL then, and say my failure is my paper got rejected. But that's not it, right?
Right, no.
There are so many insights to be gained from trying something, but really trying and not succeeding.
Oh, I love it.
Maybe we're not distinguishing this well enough from people who are just doing things that would never have worked, right? So like there's a different way to fail.
I love it. Your questions lead me to my exactly my next bullet point. Thank you. You know, like I think that indeed there are many different kinds of failure, and that also relates to your previous question, right? That, for example, I am sadly maybe one of the few people who has actually spent at least a few months trying to attack P versus NP. Like, I feel like all of us should do this. Like, everyone who claims to be a theoretician should at least spend a few months trying to prove that P is not equal to NP. But my failures there were not subtle. They were not insightful. They were just, now what? Right? And then come back the next day, now what? Right? And unfortunately, that is true. That is a way that we can fail, when we really have no idea what's going on, like we were early on in the obfuscation, in the search for obfuscation mechanisms. I would say there was a lot of that type of failure that also happened. But when it's hard fought, right? When you push and push and push and you work for weeks and months or years, then it's really hard to not have some sort of insight that was developed on your way to failure, right? Unless you're an incredibly patient person who can just sit there and stare, and stare at a blank page for forever. Although I, in sort of free association mode, I think maybe for a lot of us, my schooling years, I didn't experience too much failure. Like, generally speaking, someone would give a problem set, and experience had taught me that I would eventually solve all the problems, right? And if there was an exam, not that I got every question right, but after the exam, if I didn't get a question, I would I have to figure this out, and then I would figure it out, right? Because that was sort of the way that I saw things, and that's sort of part of what you were talking about, the training, right? The training of no failure. Like in classes, I never sort of really experienced that type of failure. I guess that's obviously a very also privileged viewpoint, but still it was the viewpoint that I saw. But then, with my very first experience with research, I was trying to understand the orbits of nilpotent elements of certain Lie groups, and I had no idea how to do it. Like, I remember spending a summer at some RU, and for weeks and weeks and weeks, I had extremely non-insightful failures where I just would look at the problem, scratch my head, and then play NetHack for the rest of the day, and repeat that process over and over again. And then there was this other student, this black mathematician, who had a related problem that he was assigned, and he had figured out something really nice, and he told me about it. I remember just feeling this aha moment, and then finally being able to make some progress on things. So I feel like, I definitely experienced that sort of failure in research, And I have to say, I found it exciting from the beginning. I think that's also something that I hope all of us can remember, right? Is that failure is actually really exciting. Like, it's actually really cool, right? When you try, and somehow it doesn't work. And you gain these insights, and those nuances and these subtleties are really important, and can be explained to people and be gained from that. And it also shows like another sort of just human foible that we all have, that when you have something that's very nuanced and very precise, and you're like, well, this doesn't work, but maybe, unfortunately, a lot of people don't have the attention span to sort of hear that out, right? And to appreciate it. And that's another thing that we have to acknowledge. We are all busy people. We don't have time to review all these papers and give them a fair shot. And sometimes, that's another reason why things don't go the way they should. It's just because things are really nuanced and it's just hard to understand. And that's something that certainly happened with the impossibility result for obfuscation. Would you like to?
Yeah, but I also want to pass the mic around a bit to have a discussion with like a broader audience. My question is, so there's this medieval idea of how intellectuals work and how ideas work, that every idea comes from a higher power. So all we can do is nurture people as much as we can, so that at some moment this idea comes down from the clouds, and then you see things. So that it doesn't make sense to think in the Middle Ages, like, do we push a researcher? Because you cannot push somebody, you just have to wait until they receive the ideas. But today we have, I guess, more of a humanist approach, where the idea is, no, you come up with your own things, and if you're not coming up with things, you're not working hard enough. So how do you see this, like the culture that we're in today, and how it compares to the past?
That's a great question. And I think, I have talked to many students over the years, and I was surprised to realize that my own experience is not universal. And I think that people have different experiences. Let me tell you about my experience. I don't see it either in those ways, either the ways that you just mentioned, actually. The way that I have experienced insights is this sort of accumulation. It's like there's some dam, and then there's like water that I'm pumping in, right? And like, as I keep learning more, like more water gets pumped in, right? And then the water keeps building up. And then at some point, I get lucky or something, some rock is in like, so it's too much. The weight is too much and the dam breaks. That's how I experience like progress, that there's sort of this build up, and then there's like, movement, and then there's build up and then movement, which it's not necessarily that I'm going out there and like trying to say, okay, where's the insight? What's the thing? Like that, at least for me, that doesn't work. What works is like, what's going on? Oh, that doesn't work. Oh, what's going on? Oh, no, that doesn't work. Oh, what's going on? And then eventually, this process of figuring out, like of mapping things out, eventually I can see, oh, wait a second, like this, I've made this cavern, and this cavern ends here. I made this other cavern, it ends here. Ooh, it's only this cool, it's not that much distance, and then there's like some way of bridging the gap. So that's at least how I experience it. I know that not everyone experiences mathematical research this way, but that's how I do. I'm curious, show of hands, how many of you experience it somewhat like what I'm describing? I'm just curious what, like how universal is my experience. Okay, cool, some people, all right, good. I won't ask who doesn't, but is there a question? Yes. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for bringing back up the history of I/O. I was here in 2013. It was my very first crypto, and I remember it was the excitement about multilinear maps was everywhere. It was tangible. That was very cool. I wonder if you could comment on a point, because I've been thinking a lot about failure, and do you think there is a pressure from the community and from in academia or not about failure? Because sometimes you feel discouraged to fail, like you don't want to publish your failure, you don't want to be embarrassed by your failure. Also, maybe you're on a tight, for example, you're a student, right? Like you were saying, like maybe you want to work on some. So does this push you away from the hard problems towards the safe things?
Right. Great question. also leads me to my next, next bullet point, which is that I think that we have to be realistic about the fact that we're all humans. We are all humans with great limitations and weaknesses and requirements that we personally have. And different people have different capabilities of handling different kinds of pressure. They're like great souls who can, who will, run towards suffering. I'm not such a person. But so I do think that as a practical matter, one does need some successes. And a great way to have successes, by the way, is something I also encourage everyone to do, which is that, fail, 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 fail. Get your first success. And there's some lesson you learned, some technique that you just figured out. Now you have a hammer and just go hit all the nails. Then you can like spend the next 10 years using that one hammer that you discovered after all that failure and get a ton of papers, right, by using it in different settings. And I think that's actually also good. Like it's good because it can help build confidence, but also it helps you understand how powerful that hammer is, right? And sometimes you have a really nice hammer, right? And you don't realize until you start hitting a whole lot of nails, right? So I think that's a good way of avoiding that feeling of failure. And it's useful because we're human beings and we do need that feeling of success. And it's, as much as we know intellectually that we should feel success from a failure, it's hard. it's just but you also lead me to the next, to my next slide, which really is just about the psychological aspect of failure, right? And really this first point is what you were getting at, which is just that it just sucks. Like it's not fun. It's not a whole lot of fun. When you work really, really hard, develop a lot of intuition, make something work, and then like, oops, it's not true, or oh, you made a mistake, or it's not fun. And I think again, just as a human being, like we need ways to deal with this. And so I thought that I might just share with you what worked for me. And I would love to hear what works for the rest of you, because I do think it's really important that we try to attack these really hard problems where failure is going to be, inevitable along the way. So the thing that worked for me the most was having awesome supportive friends, and having awesome supportive friends. So I really, really honestly, at least for me, that was by far the most important thing. Just I have, over the course of my career, accumulated a group of people who are really, really talented, but just really nice, really, true friends who will sort of stick with me through thick and thin, and will just believe in me as I'm traveling through failures, and that's just been incredibly important for me. Thank you to all of my friends. And I want to just give you like one little example of what I mean, right? And this is something that I've experienced with many of my collaborators, and I love it, and something I try to do with my collaborators as well, which is, I've had this experience very recently also, where, I'll think of something, I'm like, oh, I think I have a cool idea, right? And then I call up, my collaborator, and like, hey, I have a cool idea, but like the person's not there, and so I don't get him. And then I start walking back and forth, and I realize, oh man, my idea doesn't work. Like I found the flaw, right? And then I call up my friend, or maybe my friend calls me back. I'm like, I had an idea, but it doesn't work. And my friend says, hey, Amit, tell me anyway. I love this. To me, this really means a lot. Like when someone says, work, doesn't work, I don't care. If you had an idea, I want to hear it. I want to understand what was going on. I want to understand like what that process was. I want to learn from the failure or figure out how to fix it. So this is something that I think is just incredibly valuable for me personally. I think I'm very, very lucky, very blessed to have such people, and I encourage all of you to go and find people like this, especially if you want to work on hard problems. There are other things also, though, that I think are quite useful. Question?
I just wanted to interject.
Yeah.
That a big part of what we experience are committee-based decision-making, right? And by definition,
committees make mistakes, right? So the comment earlier about, did I succeed by getting the paper accepted versus did I succeed because I have a great idea that wasn't understood, right? Those are two different things.
Yeah.
And in particular, with groups of people setting problems for us, if you think through your earlier life, and mine I think was similar to yours, I had a lot of successes, high school, college, beginnings of graduate work, but you're given problems that other people have already solved. Right? In university, the homework assignment has a solution. You're finding something someone's already found.
So maybe we should sprinkle in unproven conjectures to all of our homeworks. You know, I think this is
There
a
are
great
people
idea.
who do that,
Right.
by the way. I had a math professor at Princeton who would give 12 problems and one was an unsolved problem and he wouldn't tell you which.
So I think adding to the failure part is to identify what's your definition of failure, right? So the committee of the program committee, et cetera, gave you some comments versus.
Yeah. And actually, let me just interrupt for a second. I also really want to highlight that also when I'm talking about having awesome friends, right? So, you know, when I say having, by the way, I also don't mean people who will just say, you know, you're awesome always. Like that's not point. There's no point in that, right? People who are your friends are going to tell you the truth. They're going to tell you like really what they think. But where if the paper got rejected, but you have these circle of people who you really trust and you care about their opinions, and they say, no, man, your work is awesome. Like, I really like it. I really like this thing that you figured out. Can you explain this thing to me? You know, that is success, right? That's another, and that's why having a group of awesome, supportive friends is so great, because it lets you have another way of evaluating your, you know, relative success, right? Yeah.
Hi. I guess I'll stand here, or no, there's a camera. Okay, I'll kneel. I wanted to bring up something you mentioned like toward the beginning, which is like you offhandedly said that it was probably harder on your students than on you. Right. And I wanted to like, I don't know, just see what anybody I guess thinks about this, because I think like structurally it's harder on students when they fail because there's a lot of pressure to get out like a first paper. Sometimes it's like your whole like status at a university depends on it. Right. And so there's not as much flexibility to just be able to like fail a bunch of times for like years. Right. And a lot of times there's not yet that support system of being able to know who to trust and who to ask this stuff about, and the people they're bouncing it off of are also in that same position. Right. So I just wonder, both like, have you noticed more attrition in students in those periods that you were mentioning of failure versus when there was like a big uptick? Right. And then also like how to address that, yeah. I guess.
This is a great question, and it's something that I've always struggled with as an advisor. I love advising students. I love having students that I'm working with. And, you know, again, each student is different. I think it's really important to understand the personality of each individual student. But something I mentioned in this last thing, like I really mean by this, where'd it go? Need successes, you know? So I think that I feel like for most students that I've had, I have felt that it was useful to seed some problems in the beginning that I feel like are more likely to be within reach, right? So that, now sometimes I'm wrong, you know, sometimes I think, oh yeah, this is gonna work. And then student says, oh, by the way, here's a counterexample. It's like, oh crap, okay. And you know, so failure, you still can't avoid failure. But you can certainly reduce the probability, right? And especially if you already have a trick, if you already have a technique and you think it might also apply to this, then, you know, those are good things to start. Because I do think people need some priming the pump, you know, sort of initial successes to feel that momentum. So I definitely believe that's a very real thing, and I think it's something that has to be taken very seriously. You also talked about whether attrition is higher at these times of dealing with failure, and yeah, definitely. I've seen that with my own students. I mean, I remember it. I was, you know, it's a while back, but I was a PhD student, and you know, definitely the times of failure were were difficult, right? I mean, of course, that's why I'm saying, like, this is the elephant in the room that has to be discussed. Like, I don't see how to have a meaningful discussion about failure in research without talking about the psychological aspect of it, right? And then there are, certain structural things that I can do just between, advisor and student. There are larger structural things that are also worth considering, and I would love to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that like my experience was that I was set up for really successful things early on, and that was very helpful to me. But I saw that most of the people I saw like leave the program, a lot of it was because they were not set up with something necessarily that had a high probability of success. And that feels like if we're talking about failure, we should talk about how much more serious it is for some people than for others. Because if you're working on 8 different projects and one of them fails, it's going to be a lot easier to handle than if you're working on one thing for 3 years. That's your whole PhD, and you're not getting anywhere. So thanks for
absolutely.
talking about that.
And I thought I would end my talk early, but apparently not. Which is great. I love it. I love all these questions. This is really what I wanted. But I actually wanted to talk about something related to that later, but I'll just talk about it now. I think it's very important for us to, as a community, to set up mechanisms to think about how we can do this, where partial progress can be really meaningfully rewarded within the community, right? And actually, I think in crypto, I just want to say, in my opinion, we're far from the worst. Like, we are actually pretty good. We're pretty good about rewarding partial progress. You have to deal with a lot of annoying reviews and, really somewhat mean and, unthoughtful comments along the way. But still, we're actually pretty good about it. We're actually pretty good about getting, accepting papers that are making meaningful progress. But we can be better, and I want us to be better. So I totally agree with what you're saying there as well. Let me just mention a few other things that have worked for me in terms of this. Actually, I think idealism is really, really, really useful. Like just remembering, why are we scientists? We're here to serve science, like we are servants of science, and we should take ourselves kind of out of it as much as we can. Like just having that thought that like, this is not about my career, this is not about like my personal success, this is about serving the greater science, like serving science. That's why I'm a scientist. And these are some, and like having, and if you think about that, within attacking your own ideas, makes sense, because that's what you're there to do. You're here as a servant of science. You want to attack your ideas because you want to attack all the ideas, right? You want to understand what's the truth and what's not the truth, right? And I think this kind of intention tune-ups, every so often taking a little while away and just sort of examining your own intentions and just realigning them to your values, the real values as to why you're a scientist to begin with. I believe that's very important. I found it important for myself. Telling the truth to yourself, I think, is also very important. Like if you tell yourself, oh yeah, this is going to work all the time, then it's going to suck even worse when it doesn't work, all right? But if you tell yourself, no, look, this is, I don't know, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, then of course the trick is to do that without discouraging yourself. So finding that like sweet spot between truth telling and non-discouragement. But that's also something that you can train yourself to do, right? Train yourself to not be discouraged while still telling yourself the truth about the fact that failure is inevitable, just because we're toddlers, right? And then, as mentioned earlier, like failure is actually exciting, and it's really important to remember that. I love this, this like famous, I don't know if it's anonymous quote, this problems worthy of attack, prove they're worth by fighting back, right? Hopefully all of you have heard that. That's really cool. I love it. There's another great quote. This is from the legendary rock band, They Might Be Giants, who said, "The truth is where the sculptor's chisel chipped away the lie." I love this. Like, I think that way of thinking about research, that like there's all this rock and like a lot of it is false, and you chip away at it until you find the truth. I think that's really motivating and beautiful to me. Thinking about humility, I think, is also very helpful when sort of dealing with failure in general. Like remembering that we are the toddlers, we're these little tiny little people. The truth is this vast, insane, uncountable thing, and we can just barely access a tiny, tiny amount of it. And I also think that, you know, speaking generally, you know, both secularly as well as non-secularly, you know, failure is something we encounter in our entire lives, right? Research is a part of our life, and we encounter failure in research and we encounter failure in life. And like having a solid spiritual foundation is very important, and certainly something that I have found to be very useful when thinking about and dealing with failure. So these are some things that have worked for me, and I would love to hear what has worked for you, what you know, what your own experiences have been like, because I think this is the ball game, in my opinion. You know, this is the ball game. Yeah.
I already have the mic, so I guess I'll just go first.
Yeah.
This isn't something that I do for myself, but I've had the benefit of working with Allison, and whenever I come to her and say like, oh, this didn't work, she's like, oh, good. Like, let's figure out why. That's great. Like, there's something here that we can learn from.
Right.
So I feel like when someone else comes to you with a failure, being like, starting with, oh, good, because I've also had the experience of being like, this didn't work.
Right.
And because the person I'm talking to is tired or whatever, is like, oh, okay, I guess we have to, you know, and then like that feels bad. So
yeah, I've also been told by some of my students that's also annoying when I do that. I'm like, oh, good, it didn't work. And they're like, what's wrong with you? But I do that a lot. I agree. I love that. Yeah.
Does anybody else?
I just wanted to add that I do think about CFAIL as trying to build some sort of public infrastructure for supporting people through that public failure phase. So I like the way you went through those periods and thinking about it as like, we have these private failures and we need to think about as a community, how do we incentivize and support people to bring them public? But then we also need to think about, once they're public, how to sort of support them through that process. And I think we've thought less about that sort of institutionally. And so we'd love to continue this conversation with everyone too. Just in general, if you have ideas for things that we can do to support and build, you know, public infrastructure for failure, we certainly would love to hear.
Excellent question. That brings me to my next slide also.
I also just want to say your Tell Me Anyway sounds like a great like CFAIL blog. I feel like we should have something like that.
Yeah. Right. So, you know, failing better, right? So how can we do things better? I think this is something, again, I would love to just have a long conversation about this with everyone. You know, one thing that's been brought up is this idea that we want to encourage progress, right? And, you know, I have had this experience, certainly, along the IO journey, where, you know, we would submit to a conference, which I will remain, you know, it'll be obvious from what I say, but, you know, submit to a conference, right? And we have some partial results, and they're like, what we really want is to get it from, you know, standard assumptions, like, And then we actually did get it from standards, and they gave us like best paper award. It's like, that's not reasonable. You can't be like either you were rejected or you get the best paper award, right? Like there should be something in between to encourage actual progress on a problem that people think is important, right? And I just think that's something that we should just think about as a community and really work to improve the committee process when thinking about, especially major questions. I think we need more conjectures. I think that we want to build a community of making bold conjectures. And these are not conjectures to prove how awesome you are at prognostication, right? That's not the point. The point of making conjectures is to drive the field. Like say, what don't I understand? Let me make a concrete conjecture about it so that at least I'll understand what the truth is. Maybe true, maybe false, but we'll make progress, right? And we see that throughout mathematics, we see that throughout science. I mean, we should do that too. And we're pretty good at it. You know, we're pretty good at it. We should do it even more. I think we should be even more encouraging of these bold conjectures. I also just think that in our context of crypto, we should really, in many cases, stop talking about assumptions, just talk about conjectures, because after all, that's what they are, they're conjectures. And I think the word assumption sometimes makes things a little unclear, or sort of conflates different psychological, you know, implications or connotations of words. I also have like a concrete research agenda, which I think is really important, which I want to work on, and I would love for many of you to work on with me, which is, you know, again, what do we do in cryptography? We deal with hardness, right? We deal with taking hard problems and making use of them to do something else, right? And yet, how many hard problems do we actually have? Like, we have this tiny handful, and we're very protective about them. You know, we're like, oh, these are the ones, and don't do anything else. Like, you know, why are you making other assumptions? That's not okay. Whereas, in my opinion, it is incumbent upon us as a community to understand what problems are hard, what problems are not hard, what makes something hard and useful. All of these fundamental questions need to be addressed. It's going to be littered with failure. Of course, this is a research agenda that will be littered with failure. Lots and lots of broken proposals, but that's good. That's the way it should be, because we don't know what's going on. We have no clue what's happening in this area, and we have to slowly build this up. And yet we can't just be like, oh, well, first solve P-not equal NP. That's not reasonable, right? And that hasn't been reasonable for us as a community, and the story of cryptography is that we haven't waited, right, for solving P-not equal NP. We have built built up this edifice without it. Similarly, it's time for us to build this edifice of what I call the hardness forge. You know, let's make a forge and start, you know, making some cool new hard problems, simple ones. Understand what kind of structure leads to hardness and also is useful. I want to bring up something that's sort of inspired by some of the questions, which of course I predicted ahead of time. No, it's not true. But, you know, I love the name CFAIL. Like, I think it's just really cool. And I think it was needed, I think, especially in the beginning, like just like talking about failure very upfront. But I can tell you that, you know, for students, right now, I think that if someone had, let's say, 7 CFAIL papers on their CV, right, they may not look that awesome to, let's say, a hiring committee who sees like, oh yeah, CFAIL, 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 CFAIL. So maybe for like the longevity of this incredibly important enterprise that is CFAIL right now, might be worth considering a renaming.
I mean, I suppose it would be on brand for CFAIL to change
Yeah.
our name.
Yeah, there we go,
So
right. Yeah.
we can certainly take it under advisement.
So, you know, maybe COBE, you know, Conference on
We need a better
Obstructions,
acronym than
Barriers,
that,
and
though.
Insights.
I will open that up to general submissions
All right.
if people have thoughts.
All right, first submission has been made. I realize it's a very modest submission, but that's it. That's all I had. Thanks for listening.
All right, thank you very much, Amit, for that wonderful talk. Let's continue questions offline if you have any, and let's break for our coffee break, and we will be back here in half an hour. Sorry, at 2:30, which is a little bit less than half an hour.
Right.